Space Marine 2 is all about seeing cool things, and I mean that as both a positive and a negative. The combat has some real panache to it at times, but most of the epic stuff floating around on the internet from this, it's all cutscenes or scripted. But I'll get into that a bit later. Let's start with the basics. It's a sequel to the Space Marine of 2011, which I liked at the time, but pretty much forgot about until recently. It's a third-person shooter/action RPG, with this latest entry having a bit more of an emphasis on character customization than shooting or action RPGing. Boy, does it love a good character customization. Personalization peaked in 2008 with Rainbow Six Vegas 2, and has just always been a little too fiddly for me since then. Mostly because every game has classes now, which necessitates multiple silhouettes, plus DLC costumes have become standard instead of just giving color options for a nice range of standard cosmetics. Monetization has killed customization, but I digress. Space Marine 2. Let's roll. The combat in Space Marine 2 is perfectly average. The game splits focus between melee and gunplay, and in the process, neither of them really shines. There's around a dozen primary weapons, but over half of them are just variants of the standard bolt gun. It's a mixed box of chocolates that only has those awful coconut things. I played on the PS5, and this is the first console shooter I've played in a while where I've reactivated the default auto-aim. And it's a strong auto-aim. Without it, the gunplay seems erratic, like the dead zone on the sticks is way too stiff. It's not as bad as some Warhammer games, but it is still noticeable. By default, the shoulder buttons are melee and parry, then the triggers control our gunplay. This felt really bad to me, anyways. The majority of our enemies are getting right in our face, and guns are relatively underpowered with limited ammunition, so we're pretty well forced to adopt a hybrid combat style. I know some people play with a different controller grip than me, but I keep my trigger fingers on my triggers, and it was not fun maneuvering into melee combat. And none of the controller presets moved both melee controls onto the standard buttons. But this probably wouldn't have been a problem on the keyboard. There's also a bit of Dark Souls influence here, in that dodge rolling is now really necessary. We're generally fighting a mix of large hordes with a sprinkling of tougher special enemies mixed in. It's taking a page from Left 4 Dead or the Vermintide series here, and the Tyranid work well for that purpose, but I just don't like fighting the Tyranid. Something about them feels weirdly shapeless in this game, like I'm fighting a pool of purple rather than an actual, tangible enemy. I guess that aligns with lore, but it feels like a downgrade from fighting a charismatic enemy like the orcs. I guess my biggest complaint about the combat in Space Marine 2 is that it doesn't feel the way I'd expect a Space Marine would fight. When I think of a Blood Angel, I think of a 10-foot-tall transhuman monster charging into battle like an F-150 through a school zone. But in Space Marine 2, we're delicate and papery, flittering about hither and thither with rolls and parries. We've got more defensive and avoidance options than aggressive options. There's no health regen and limited armor regen. The various quick time ripostes will restore armor, and if you're very quick you can regain a little bit of health right when you get hit. But it just didn't feel right. Like the game would have benefited from aping a little more of Doom, or taking a page out of a Battletech game and giving us regenerating directional armor. As is, the Space Marines just feel a little frail, a little too human. As I said at the top, there's a lot of cool stuff to see in this game, but for the most part it isn't well centered around the player. I hate to frame Call of Duty as a good example of anything, but their campaigns have always let the player lead the carnage. Think of how many times someone calls in an AC-130 and the player's view flicks up to the sky, where we take control of the big guns. Space Marine 2 is sorely lacking that level of personal control. There's massive set pieces playing out constantly, from tank charges to desperate last stands, but they're always either off in the distance or resolved in cutscenes. Personally, I much prefer when a game lets me actually do the cool stuff rather than rip the control away while something happens over there. Beyond that though, this is a really nice looking game. The amount of enemies on screen is pretty staggering at times, and the environments do a pretty good job of escalating from the Catholic Foundry aesthetic in the first game The levels where we interact with the Mechanicus have this bizarre, viney cable server room feel that I really dig, but the actual interaction of gameplay and level design is a bit lackluster. There's only a handful of really notable arenas scattered around the runtime, and there's an awful lot of very generic hallways and swamplands to work through. The levels just never really evolve in very interesting ways as we progress. They're just pretty enough places to smash ahead in. Most of these problems are hugely exacerbated in the player versus player. Without the scripted spectacle of the campaign, the PvP is just dull. Levels are few and incredibly static, just a couple of large wheel-shaped arenas without much inventiveness or inspiration. It's clearly tuned for an intense teamwork that's purely theoretical in public matches. The time to kill is long, and everyone is incredibly mobile, so getting a ranged kill before someone rolls to safety is basically a fluke. Most of my games ended with 1 or 2 players having double-digit assists. Melee is currently pretty useless since human players can just infinitely dodge away. It becomes a game of who can gang up on the other team better. Focus fire is more or less the only tactic worth considering. It also retraces the biggest sin of the first game, although in a lesser capacity. All the cool gear in PvP is locked away at bizarrely high levels. 30 matches in, I still haven't unlocked any new weapons for the heavy class. It's not quite as bad as the first game, which halved your combat effectiveness until you reached high level. But in my opinion, and I know this is unpopular, multiplayer games should not give the best toys to the people with the most experience. The highest ranking people should have guns that shoot sideways and constantly misfire. Give the scrubs a chance, make it interesting. Apart from PvP, there's also a co-op mode called Operations. Every co-op game can be fun. That's the beauty of playing with people you like. There are only 6 missions, with difficulty scaling that is pretty solely tied to a few arbitrary MMO-style experience and perk trees, plus equipment score. At first, it's missing the sort of variety that makes other co-op games shine. Too few enemy types, too few objectives, and it's missing those slightly randomized set pieces that define the co-op genre and makes replaying those games fun. As you increase in difficulty, though, it makes a stab at including those modifiers, more random mini-boss fights, but it's missing the actual cooperative elements from those games. Helping your teammates dangling from a ledge, passing equipment back and forth, that sort of thing doesn't happen. It feels weirdly like 3 people each playing a single-player game. Somewhere around 20 hours into the co-op, the gameplay finally clicked for me. I took aim assist off, suddenly got very good at parrying attacks, and it was really fun. However, during my time playing Operations, I cumulatively lost around 10 hours of progress. No idea why. One time it seemed to happen because I switched to PvP after running a handful of missions. The other time my squad leader crashed at the end of a mission, and when I loaded back in, I was 4 levels lower. It's temperamental, and losing progress in a game mode that is so driven towards accumulation is very, very frustrating. I think with a few patches and more content, this will probably become a very solid co-op mode, but for now it's frustrating. So, here's my verdict. Space Marine 2 does a lot of things okay, but it's not breaking new ground anywhere, and the aesthetic and franchise is the main draw. In my mind, there's a certain handful of games. A game that doesn't take any big swings, with gameplay that feels standard. A game that lingers in my mind only to act as a perfectly average measurement. A benchmark. It's like Skyrim. There's a lot of first-person RPGs with better gameplay, and a lot with worse. Whenever I'm in a new first-person RPG, I'm always thinking, which side of Skyrim does this game fall on? Space Marine 2 is my new benchmark for third-person action RPGs. On the pain scale, I'd give Space Marine 2 a moderate. The visuals are super impressive, but the moment-to-moment gameplay just felt average. I kinda wish I had liked it more. That being said, the game is so overwhelmingly Warhammer that any fan of the franchise will probably have the time of their life. And frankly, my opinion is probably a bit tainted by the dozens or hundreds of games in this exact genre I've played. At this point, I crave novelty more than a game that's so straightforward. Well, that's all for my 25th review, a quarter of the way to my goal of 100 videos. Feels pretty good. I'll probably head back to the Stalker franchise so I can wrap up the originals before the sequel releases in November, supposedly. It keeps changing. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, see ya!